Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So today I wanted to look at a specific example of converting a UDM Pro from the legacy firewall to the new zone-based firewall. And I've done this now on a couple of different firewalls, but I wanted to take a look at this one in particular, which is a friend of mine, David's UDM Pro. So here we have his default network, which is VLAN 1. He has his IoT network, which is VLAN 10. And we have the DMZ network, which is VLAN 20. And here, if I go over to the traffic and firewall rules, we have a very simple set of firewall rules. In fact, we hardly have anything. We simply have an allow Pi-hole IoT to his mesh central. We have accept NTP requests, which is kind of obsolete since NTP traffic will carry the way it needs to. That's network time protocol. And then we have allow established related sessions, which really worked fine in this legacy firewall, but not something that we're going to need in the zone-based firewall since it has the concept of return traffic. And then we have two rules that say block IoT to main LAN and block DMZ to main LAN. So on a traditional firewall, we had things like internet or WAN and LAN, and that would be LAN in, LAN out, guest, internet for IPv6 and LAN for IPv6 and guest networks. And so if we scroll to the top of this here, it says upgrade to the new zone-based firewall. I understand from Ubiquiti that the zone-based firewall is a complete rewrite of the current legacy firewall. And so after you do the upgrade, it always gives you an opportunity to roll back. But prior to an upgrade, you should be making a backup copy of your Unifi OS and your Unifi network controller just to make sure you have complete backups in the event that you want to have the option to roll back. So if you don't have a backup already, you want to go ahead and click on System underneath Settings. And once you get over to System, go over to Backups, and then you want to go ahead and say that you want to download a backup, and this backup will be a backup for your Unifi network controller, which includes all the configuration for your router device, your gateway device, as well as all of your switches or access points. If we click Settings Only, I suggest you go down and select one of the options for doing a backup, including the last 7 days of data, which can also include things like DHCP address reservations. I'm not going to go ahead and choose the option here, but you could go ahead and click download, and it will produce that backup and download it to your local machine in the downloads folder. Next, you want to go ahead and scroll down to where it says control plane. Click on your control plane, go over to backups, and this will be the backup for Unifi OS. And here you can see that I've got it set up to do a weekly backup, and the last one was actually done just a little while ago. And you can do a new backup, or you can click on download. And when you click on download, that will do a backup download for all of the Unifi applications in Unifi OS. Now that we have backups of both of our systems there, we're going to go ahead and scroll back up and select Traffic and Firewall Rules. And at the top here, we choose Click to upgrade to the new zone-based firewall. And when we click that, it'll say upgrade to the new zone-based firewall. It has some pictures of the zones that it will create, and it says all existing networks will be migrated to the new internal zone. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We simply click upgrade. And the upgrade usually doesn't take very long, and we have already performed this upgrade, and so it said you can restore the previous configuration here, and it will give you that option for as close as I can determine a week or two. And if after a week or two that option disappears, your option would be to restore your backup that we just created. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of control minuses just to put a little bit more on the screen here. And we have here now, after the conversion, we have the default network, the IoT VLAN, and the DMZ VLAN all in the internal zone. And if we float over the top of that, it says that the internal zone contains clients on trusted networks that are allowed to access all other built-in zones by default. And then we have the external zone. The external zone includes your WAN interfaces that you have connecting to your ISP or ISPs, and then it may also list VPN clients if you're using VPN clients on the Unifi controller. And then the next zone here is called Gateway. By default, they don't put anything in the Gateway zone, and it's actually used to control management traffic to potentially other gateways. And then we have here the VPN zone, and that contains the one VPN server that we have on this particular UDM Pro. There's nothing in the hotspot zone right now, and there's nothing in the DMZ zone. If you have a guest network configured, you would see it in the hot zone or hotspot zone, and the DMZ zone is optionally used for public servers for maybe self-hosted applications out to the internet, and I use that zone myself. So now that we have our zones created, if we scroll down just a little bit, we get a matrix here. And in the upper left-hand corner of the matrix, it says that we have a total of 89 policies. Most of those policies are policies that have been flowed over as standard policies or default policies. So we don't really refer to things as firewall rules anymore. We refer to them as policies. And the way the matrix works is that on the y-axis here, we have the source, which is the originating network, and on the x-axis, we have the destination zone. So as an example, if we start in the internal zone and we go to the external zone, we're allowing all traffic. And if I click on that, it will only list down here rules which apply going to the external zone. So in this particular case, it's saying we are blocking Facebook, and that's not a firewall rule per se. That is a policy. And we have a allow Pi-hole IoT to Mesh Central, which was one of his rules, and we have an accept NTP request, and we have an allow establish related sessions. So we can see those here, but if I go back up to all policies, if I can click on all policies here, now this list gets extremely long, and one of the things you notice is that we had an accept NTP request as a firewall rule before we did the conversion. Now we have 4 such policies, each of them called accept NTP request. If we look to the right, we can see the source is all our local addresses, and the source zone is internal, but the destination zone on the first is the internal zone. The destination is the hotspot zone on the second. the destination is the VPN zone on the third, and the destination is the external zone on the fourth. So the only reason that during the conversion to the policy-based firewall that Ubiquiti does this is they are trying to avoid a problem where they end up blocking something as a result of the conversion. But many of these rules are going to be unneeded, and you can end up deleting them, and we'll go through a little bit of that.
So Scott, as from what I understand and I see here, after the conversion, it looks like, for example, that firewall rule that says accept NTP requests, Unifi put that rule into those 4 destination zones that I see at the bottom right hand side of the screen.
Right. So if we look at, for example, one that we know isn't needed. So as an example, we don't want to necessarily do NTP request from the internal zone to the VPN zone. That really wouldn't be meaningful. So the internal zone to the VPN zone, if I click on that, I'm only going to get the rules that apply to that. And so here's that accept NTP request rule. And if I click on it, it opens the screen. And this screen basically says, okay, this rule applies to the internal zone, and it's specifically anything in the internal zone, because I had a group called all local addresses, and it says any ports, and we're allowing them to the VPN zone. So that's a very promiscuous rule. We don't really need that rule, and it really doesn't apply. So if I click remove on that rule and I say proceed, it deletes that rule. Now if I go back to all policies up here, you'll see that there's only 3 accept NTP requests. Does that kind of help with the answer to that question?
It does, but if you have a long list of these firewall rules, I assume you have to go one by one through that entire list.
Well, there's actually a little bit better way to do that. We can do a manage down here at the bottom, and we can come up here to the top. And I happen to know that I'm not going to need any. I'm going to go ahead and the only rules I'm going to keep are the internal to internal rules. And the reason I know is because if I need to modify them later, I can do so. But I know I don't need the ones between the zones, and if I do need the ones between zones, I can fix those too, because all these redundant rules really weren't needed. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the 2 NTP requests that are not internal to internal. I'm going to click on the allow established related, and in fact I know I don't need any established related rules at all, and I'll explain that in just a minute. And then the allow Pi-hole to IoT mesh, I'm going to take those away except for the internal to internal. And then the same thing with the block DMZ, which, as it turns out, there's only a 1 block DMZ here and 1 block IoT to main LAN. So now that I have all those highlighted, I'm going to run to the bottom of this, and I'm going to click on the remove option. And it'll say, hey, do you really want to remove all these policies? This is not reversible. I'll go ahead and click proceed. Now, when I come up here and go to all policies, the only policies you see in here are that 1, accept NTP requests from internal to internal, allow IoT to mesh central, which is, again, internal to internal, the block DMZ to main LAN, which is internal to internal, and the block IoT to main LAN, which is internal to internal.
So, Scott, now that we got rid of all those other rules that you showcased, does that mean it's going to break anything on the network?
Well, not for right now. And the reason for that is because if we scroll up here and look at our zone listing, you'll notice that the default network, which is our main LAN, the IoT VLAN, and the DMZ VLAN are all part of the internal network. So anything that's part of the, I should have said internal zone, anything that's part of the internal zone means that anything in the internal zone can communicate with any other zone. So does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, it does.
So here's the thing. We probably don't want our IoT network communicating back to our internal network or internal zone. In other words, we don't want our IoT VLAN to be able to talk to our main LAN. That's the whole point of an IoT VLAN. We want it isolated. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new zone. And that new zone I'm going to create is going to be called IoT. And then it gives me the option to select networks or interfaces. When I do that, I'm going to select the IoT VLAN and click Save. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Add Entry and proceed. So what that will do is that moved the IoT VLAN out of the internal zone and moved it down here to the IoT zone. And I might point out at the same time, it's only possible for one network or VLAN to be the member of a single zone. So there's no such thing as having a network that is joined to more than one zone.
Scott, I noticed something interesting. You created a new zone called IoT VLAN, but before the conversion, as you saw, we had a firewall rule that blocked all IoT traffic to my main default LAN. So I would have thought that in Unifi, it would sort of intuitively have that built-in intelligence to understand that firewall rule and perhaps create a new zone with a default name so that you didn't have to create that VLAN that you just showed earlier.
Well, that's kind of a good point. And I think in order to accomplish that, they would have had to apply a level of AI to the conversion because looking at the rules, I think they erred on the side of extreme conservatism not to block any traffic as opposed to something else. But that's a really good point. Let's go down and look at that rule again, if we can find it here. And that rule was block IoT to main LAN. Notice how it's grayed out here after we moved the IoT zone out of the internal zone. And it's grayed out because if we move over the top, it says the matched network is no longer present, meaning that network is no longer present in the internal zone. So let's go ahead and click block IoT to main LAN, and the source zone for IoT is now no longer the internal zone. It is the IoT zone because that's where the IoT network is. And let's just assume that we had more than one network in the IoT zone. We could then click on network here and we could do a select and say, I want the IoT network. I didn't really have to go through that step because the IoT zone only contained the IoT VLAN. So this is somewhat redundant that I put both of those in there. So that's the source zone for this rule. The action will be block as opposed to allow because we want to block traffic from the IoT zone to the main LAN. And so the option is block. And if we move down here, the destination zone is the internal zone. So that's just fine. I really don't need to fill in anything else here besides that. So now I can click apply and that rule will no longer be grayed out. It will be highlighted once again because we have updated that rule, but I'm still noticing it grayed out. I'm assuming that's because it's provisioning. So due to the magic of live recording, as you'll recall, I went in and I edited this particular firewall policy. And when I edited it, we had the source zone set up correctly, the IoT VLAN set up correctly, But remember, before we edited this and we moved the IoT network out of the internal zone and we moved it over to the IoT zone, it ended up disabling the rule because the rule wasn't valid. And so we have the destination zone as internal and we have the network set up as default, which is the way it was before, except that now we're pointing to that new IoT zone. But we had to scroll all the way to the bottom of this firewall policy, and at the bottom, you'll notice that the rule was actually paused, and we have to click on resume, and then when we click on resume, it will go ahead and highlight that rule if I can actually click on it correctly here. There we go. And now that rule is in effect. So we have the block IoT to main LAN, and that basically says if the source zone is IoT and the source network is IoT VLAN, the destination is internal and it is the default network, then block all traffic going to it.
Scott, can we go into that block IoT main LAN
Sure.
rule again? Because I was looking at it if you scroll down, and I thought in that section right there for the destination rule that that default network didn't have to be there, and you changed it from network to any.
Well, that's a good point because if we remove this and we just go to any here, that's going to be perfectly valid. And I'll tell you what the difference will be. Now that we've done it that way, it essentially says that anything on the IoT network cannot access anything in the internal zone. So not just the default network, but also not the DMZ network, which is probably more correct. And that's kind of where the power of zone-based firewalls go, because we don't need to create a rule for each of these things when we can just point to a zone and have everything in the zone apply to that rule. Is that clear?
That makes sense. You make the configuration change once, it can apply to one zone or multiple zones without having to create basically different rules. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So, David, you kind of pointed out a really interesting point in how these networks operate interactively with the zones. And in fact, now that we have this rule for the IoT zone communicating back to the internal zone, we should go in our little matrix here and look at internal zone as the source going to the IoT zone. And we really want the internal zone to be able to talk to the IoT zone. And yet we don't have the ability to do that right now. Whereas if we look at the internal zone or the IoT zone going to the internal zone, we do have all of the traffic blocked, which is exactly what we wanted. And I recognize that because we created a new zone, we in fact didn't really even have to create this block IoT to main LAN, because by default, the separate zone only allows things to communicate within that zone. So I wasn't going to have an issue with the IoT zone communicating back to the main zone. So in reality, I could go up here and I could delete that particular firewall rule that we just created, or that particular policy. Because look, anything starting at IoT can't go to internal because it says block all traffic. And what you're seeing here is the actual power of zone-based firewalls, because in the past, where we needed to create a rule, here we do not. Now, if we look in the reverse direction, we probably want to sit on our internal network and communicate with the IoT zone. So here, if I go from the source being IoT and the destination, or the source being internal and the destination being IoT, here we see that's also block all traffic. I think I really want to allow that. So I can create a policy which basically says allow internal to IoT. And I think, David, at one point in time, you pointed out to me that on Cisco, by default, when you create new networks, all traffic is blocked to other networks. And likewise, it's similar with the new zone-based firewall in that zones by default don't have any access to any other zones unless you create a policy. How's that?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, so now we do want our internal zone, and I'll just say anything in my internal zone, allowed to my IoT zone. And I'm going to allow return traffic. So this auto allow return traffic is the same as allow establish related that we used to have with the old firewall. So now I can say click policy, and now we can sit up here on our main network and we will be able to go to the IoT network, for example, SSH to servers on the IoT network. But anything on the IoT network, as we can see by looking at the source IoT and going back to internal, says only internal return traffic is allowed, but all initiating traffic is blocked. So now if we go up and we look at our zone list here, we notice that there is nothing in the DMZ zone. And yet you have a network up here called DMZ, which is actually for your self-hosted applications. So what I really want to do is I want to click on Manage Zones. And when I click on Manage Zones, that gives me the option to go off and delete other zones or modify other zones. The only zone I have the ability to remove or modify is the one that I added called IoT. And in this particular case, we don't really want to modify that zone in particular. So what we really want to do is we want to click on our DMZ zone here. And in our DMZ zone, under here, select networks and interfaces, I'm going to select the DMZ network. And I'll go ahead and do a save and an apply. And what that will do, and it gives me the standard warning here because you might mess up your access to networks. I do a proceed. And now that I've done a proceed, you've noticed that the DMZ network has moved from the internal zone down to the DMZ zone. So the first thing we want to look at is what rules applied to that. So if we're on the DMZ zone and we're going to the internal zone, that would be this block right here. And it basically says that we can allow all return traffic, but to block all regular traffic. And we can go to the internal zone, going to the DMZ zone, and it says allow all traffic from the internal zone to the DMZ zone. So just in virtue of the default policies for the zones, I don't have to add anything in particular. And that really means that I can sit on my internal zone, the default network, and I can SSH over to anything on the DMZ zone. And I can also, from the previous rules we discussed, SSH over to the IoT VLAN as well. So one of the things that happened as a side effect of moving the DMZ network out of the internal zone and putting it into its own zone named DMZ was the fact that if we scroll down here, you notice that the block DMZ to main LAN is grayed out. And the reason it's grayed out is because if we move over here, it says the matched network no longer exists in the internal zone. But as I said earlier, we don't really need that block DMZ to main LAN rule anymore. And the reason we don't need that is because the other network is in a different zone, by default that's going to be blocked. So I'll go down here and do a remove on the block DMZ to mainland rule, and I'll go ahead and proceed, and that will remove that. So one of the other things we have here is we have this accept network time protocol request, which was kind of legacy. It's something I had done a really long time ago. And I'm going to come down here and pause this rule because I don't think this rule is needed anymore. And I'll say proceed, pause that, and it goes ahead and turns that gray, and we'll find out if anything breaks. So we boiled this down to allow internal zone to the IoT network. And since the IoT network was on its own zone called IoT, no network would have access to it, and it wouldn't have access to any other network. And then we have this allow Pi-hole to IoT, allow Pi-hole IoT, which is another Pi-hole on the IoT network, to the Mesh Central. So our Mesh Central server is actually living on our main LAN, and so in this particular case, I am trying to get the internal zone is the source zone, and so I want to allow that Pi-hole IoT access to it. But guess what? Since we moved the IoT network over into its own IoT zone, this is no longer accurate. So we really want to say if the source zone is the IoT network, then we want to go ahead and allow traffic to the internal zone, and that is to Mesh Central. But specifically, we want to allow only one device, and we're going to click device, and then we're going to type in IoT, or Pi-hole IoT. And so the Pi-hole IoT is the thing we want to have access to. It's the one that's lit up here. These others are kind of legacy that were in there. And so I go ahead and click save, and then I click apply changes. Or wait a second, look down here. Let's see, allow. Yes, we also want to allow auto return traffic on this. So basically, anything that starts out on the IoT network that is only the IoT Pi-hole can go to the destination zone internal if and only if it's talking to the Mesh Central server. And now I applied that rule, and we've updated that rule accordingly.
Hey, Scott, I was just curious. I noticed you had grayed out the policy that says accept NTP request. Could you elaborate that a little bit further?
So the reason for that is because normally network time protocol requests come from individual servers or clients on the network. And the way that they satisfy NTP request, unless you have a local NTP server, is they're going to satisfy those requests from NTP service. So in this particular case, let's say we were on the 192.168.1 network. What it would do is it would go to the default gateway 192.168.1.1, and it would search for wherever the NTP server would be. And by default, that NTP server is probably one offered out on the WAN, and that's how it would contact that server. The only real reason why you would have a policy for accepting NTP request is if we were hosting an NTP server on one of my VLANs and we wanted things from other VLANs to be able to query that NTP server. Okay, so at this point we want to go ahead and check out our firewall rules and make sure that everything's operating as expected. So here I'm bringing up a WSL2 prompt on this Windows machine, and we're going to do an SSH over to Pi-hole-IoT, And we're going to do an if config over here, and you can see that we are connected to 10.10.10.30, whereas our network for this desktop is 192.168.1. And likewise, we can go ahead and exit from that and do an SSH over to remotely. And remotely is one of the applications that is on the DMZ network. And when we do that, we can do an if config here, and we can see that we are on 10.10.20, which is the DMZ network subnet. So conversely, we are blocking traffic from the DMZ network back to the internal or main LAN. And to test that, we can do a ping of 192.168.1.10, which is a host out on the main LAN. And you can see here that the ping is not responding, meaning that the device is not reachable. And here, if I exit and come back to the desktop here, which is on the internal network, if I do a ping of 192.168.1.10, that ping will respond correctly because this device and the target device are both on the internal zone. Now let's go ahead and go SSH back to our Pi-hole IoT, and likewise we'll do a ping of 192.168.1.10, and it should not be able to reach that machine on the main LAN or on the internal zone. And likewise, this ping also does not work, which leads us to the conclusion that our firewall rules are performing as expected. So now that we've tested out our firewall rules here, one of the things that I note as a result of having converted from the legacy firewall over to the zone-based firewall is that we require far fewer rules than we required in the legacy firewall. And so is that something that you can see, David?
I can. Absolutely see that. Once I understood the paradigm and how you explained it, it does make a lot of sense, and it's easier to navigate and far fewer steps in terms of the configuration. So I agree.
I think that one of the things that I noticed when I first got into it was that when you did the conversion and you got 4 firewall rules for every one of your existing firewall rules because they were trying to make sure that they didn't restrict traffic to any of the other zones. That to me was very confusing. And so in my particular case, I think I had like 12 rules. And so I ended up with something like 48 rules out there, and I found it just overwhelming. As a result of having gone down and gone through the process of deleting the redundant rules and then going out and creating rules that made sense, realizing that you don't need to create firewall rules a lot of times if your networks are in different zones. That's what makes all the difference here. So any other questions you can think of?
No, I think you covered it all. You explained it in very good detailed terms. I think as people understand and they're used to how it was configured in the old system, there might be a little bit of a learning curve, but I think the way that you explained it in very clear language will help your audience to understand it better. And that's the whole point of this video.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to use your network as a guinea pig in order to pull off this demonstration. That's about it for today. Please let me know if you think that this is a formula that works and if you'd like to see more presentations like this in the future. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe and like because it sure helps out the channel. And don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.